start with a question about ethics. And we'll leave you till the end, so you can take a break. Lisa, breath. You mentioned the fact that many people live to over 100, and indeed, where I work, we take care of 135 people over the age of 100. So it's an issue that resonates with me very much. So I think there's a really significant question around what happens as survival rates increase dramatically, and what are the ethical issues that are involved in end-of-life care. So would any of you like to share your experiences around that?
There's one clinician here. End-of-life care is a huge financial cost to individuals and the healthcare system. And when a person is at end of life, you really, really need to bring in the family as well as the patient to help make the decision and to understand the options, that none of their therapies will necessarily prolong that person's quality of life. I remember back in training when I was in the ICU, when people were at the end of life with several IV lines and a heart monitor, unconscious on a respirator. And I always felt in my mind that the image looked to me like a science fair project. So we really, really, as a community of healthcare providers, have to set up reasonable expectations with the patient and their family.
Thank you. Josie?
Well, I have colleagues who specialise only in end-of-life care stuff, so there are a whole host of ethical issues that come up when people are receiving care near the end of life, and they're really different depending on the kind of capacity that the person themselves has to make decisions and how capable they are of navigating the decision-making process. I will say that people in my field spend a long time trying to convince people that they should do more planning for their own, make sure they have people who know what they want, and that they talk about it. And it's amazing because we still have really low rates of advanced care planning in this country, even though people have been working at this for a long time. And so I think it would be really behoove us as individuals to just think about what's really standing in the way of us making plans. So that, because we have to take some responsibility, I guess, for kind of making that happen, and then systematically we have to figure out what the stumbling blocks are in our systems of care. And it doesn't help that attempts to actually pay for the conversation between a physician and a patient about end-of-life care planning get called death panels and have all of their funding taken away. So you get what you pay for a little bit as well.
Yes. No, and I think one of the takeaways for everybody is the responsibility to think about advanced care planning. So we're going to come back to the death panels only because I want to come back to Obamacare before we leave. But I want to switch for a moment to women in science, because Larry Summers made the issues around women being effective and competent to be in science a front page story in the New York Times many days. So could each of you comment on what it was like for you to enter into the field of science, and what advice you would have for young women wanting such a career?
So I'd like to actually start by talking about women in medicine, because my husband is 67, and when he went to medical school, there was one girl in his medical school class. And my sister is 60, and when she went to medical school, there were 5 girls in her medical school class of 150. And now if you go to any medical school class in the country, it's 50-50 or even more girls than boys. And that's just a sign of the fact that something that seemed unthinkable 40 years ago is now so normal that if you even asked, oh, can women be doctors? Can we deal with this hard field? And people would laugh at you. And that's what it needs to be like in every field. It needs to be that when someone asks, oh, can women do this? You just laugh. And I think the key number is 3, actually. I think if there's only 1 woman in a field, then she's very special and she's something unusual. And if there are 2, then they're either a clique or they're antagonists or something. People have this strange psychology. And as soon as there are 3 women in the room, all of a sudden it's not a big deal. And I've talked to other people about this, people in areas like journalism and business, and they think the rule of 3 is not a bad rule. So once we get there, I think then people will laugh, and then we'll be where we need to be. So it's not perfect yet, but you can't give up.
I think that one of the biggest difficulties for keeping young women in science, because as Corey just pointed out, we're seeing some spectacular changes about women feeling that they can and will pursue these kinds of careers. But I think that there's still a big challenge, and that is keeping good women in science. Science, like all human endeavors, is very, very difficult. You're only as good as the last thing that you did. And so often, in academic science, the tenure clock and the biological clock are ticking in parallel. And so women oftentimes feel that they need to choose between continuing to be hard driving in science or stepping aside, not stepping off of any track, but just stepping aside for a moment to have a child. And I think universities have come to realize that they have to do a whole lot more in order to make the workplace family friendly, and that is terrific. But I want to just raise an interesting, and when I raise this, I get some raised eyebrows, and it may be a somewhat controversial point. Not only do we need to continue to make it easier for women to think about having children when they're most likely to do that and do it well, but I think we also owe it to men, to their husbands, to their partners, to encourage them to take more of a role as parents. I have had many young women come into my office and close the door and start to cry and say they are so frustrated by the situation that they see. They know they can get an extra year on their tenure clock if they have a baby. But they also see that they are the ones that take responsibility when the child is sick. And I've seen it now for almost 30 years. Oftentimes, young men who have just become a parent take pride in saying, I was back at work 24 hours after that baby was born. The young women see that and they're frustrated by it. They want more of a partnership with their husbands, with their partners in raising children. And I think, in part, to solve this problem, we as a society have to remind men that they are as good in the nurturing arena as they are in the professional arena.
I don't think that was controversial at all. Lisa?
I think it's very easy for a woman to become a doctor in that they have the skills to go through medical school, and more than 50% of medical school classes have women. The issue is after medical school, after your residency, you get your first job, and then you want to progress in medicine. The leadership decisions are still made by white men. There is little diversity. In fact, this past weekend, I was in Dallas for the American Heart Association meeting, and the data is that of all the board-certified cardiologists in the United States, only 12% are women. Part of it are decisions that women make when they go into cardiology, because part of cardiology deals with doing interventional procedures, being exposed to radiation, taking time off from your job, balancing your family and your life. But there are many aspects of cardiology, chairs of departments and divisions, lead researchers, taking the lead in organizations like the American Heart Association and the American College of Cardiology. So I think we're not just there yet. And there are very few women who are deans of medical schools or chiefs of departments. So that's what we need to work on.
Josie?
Well, I don't work directly in science. I have to say that I used to be a lawyer, and in like my first month of being a lawyer, I encountered this issue that I was a woman and I was a lawyer, and that couldn't possibly be the case that someone so young and female was a lawyer. And then I went into bioethics and into academia, and I felt like, well, it's not an issue for me. And only recently have I encountered situations. So you know you're in trouble when you get to that point in your career where you start to encounter that stuff. And for me, you know, it didn't come until quite recently. And one thing I did actually, you'll get a laugh out of this, is I stopped colouring my hair. I thought maybe if they could see that I had grey hair, I wouldn't. I started again. But I did it for a little while because part of me was just like, take me seriously. And people, you know, they recognise and they like what they recognise. So it's not a sort of first generation sexism, it's second generation or third generation of like, two candidates are sitting for a job. One is a woman who, you know, has a long and important career that has some breaks in it. Another is a young guy who sort of never stopped. And they see him and they think, he's a real go-getter, because they identify themselves with him. And those moments have started to happen to me, and I've started to notice that sort of thing. And I don't think it's specific to the career, it's just sort of the way in which we still have a ways to go.
Well, I certainly